Good evening, ladies and gents. I'm your host, Joseph J. McAllister, welcoming you to the first edition of photography's Dark History. So go ahead and dim the lights, make a fresh cup of joe, and maybe even spice it up a little bit, if the mood hits you. For we're traveling down a dark and lonely road, a morbid spectacle, that are the real-life tales of terror of photography's morbid history. What is it about photography that can drive a man mad? Is it the ether fumes of the colloidal process, the cyanide gas slowly seeping from the cyanotype proof prints, phantoms of Daguerre's mercury fuming process, the repeated dipping of hands in deadly cyanide while clearing tintypes, or the slow seeping of formaldehyde from tiny bottles used as an emulsion hardener? Yes, any of these things are enough to drive a man stark raving mad. Well, in this case, merely meeting a photographer was enough to drive one man over the edge and drive him to murder over 200 of his victims, or at least that's what he claims. Tonight's case, Herman Webster Mudgett, May 16th, 1861 through May 7th, 1896. Known to his friends and colleagues in Chicago as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. History would remember him as H.H. Holmes, America's first serial killer. Now, Holmes was not his real name, but the alias that he was living under at the time of his most heinous crimes and conviction. Holmes used many aliases, often changing his name and moving from city to city to avoid the law. Henry M. Howard, Henry Gordon, Alexander Bond, O.C. Pratt, D.T. Pratt, A.E. Cook, and G. Howell. The year was 1886. Holmes was a young man of 25 in the big city of Chicago. Holmes was employed at Elizabeth Holton's drugstore at South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street in Inglewood. Holmes eventually bought the drugstore from Miss Holton. In 1887, Holmes bought an empty lot across from the drugstore and began construction on a new building. The first floor had a new drugstore and retail spaces. The second floor was Holmes's office and 100 rooms used for apartments. In 1892, he began construction of a third floor, which would become the World's Fair Hotel. This was in preparation for the World's Fair Columbian Exhibition of 1893, just 3 miles from the hotel. Construction of the third floor was never completed. History would remember Holmes's World's Fair Hotel by a more ominous name, the Murder Castle. Holmes used this hotel to lure unsuspecting fairgoers, only to find themselves in a labyrinth of locked rooms, trapdoors, hidden passages, and body chutes. He locked his guests in rooms and forced them to leave their money and property to him in signed wills. He took out insurance claims on wives, fiancés, and employees, which he later collected after their mysterious disappearances. Holmes used soundproof rooms and gas lines to asphyxiate his guests, then dumped their bodies down body chutes into the basement, where they would be dissected and sold as anatomy skeletons. Some he cremated, and others he dissolved in large pits of lye that were dug into the basement floor. Throughout the building there were trapdoors, peepholes, body chutes, and stairways that led to nowhere. The basement served as a macabre laboratory for Dr. Holmes. It had a dissecting table, stretching rack used for torture, and a crematorium. Holmes even had a collection of fake beards and disguises. Holmes often explained away the mysterious disappearances as people suddenly moving to a new state to get married. In October 1895, Holmes was put on trial for the murder of his colleague Benjamin Pitezel, found guilty and sentenced to death. In all, Holmes confessed to 27 murders, although some of his victims were still living at the time. Later accounts suspect Holmes of murdering over 200 people. After his arrest, Holmes mentioned that his facial appearance had changed drastically since his incarceration. He described his appearance as gruesome and taking a satanical cast. He wrote that he was beginning to resemble the devil. And at one point, Holmes even claimed he was possessed by Satan. Holmes even wrote a detailed autobiography and confession of his crimes while at Moyamensing prison in Philadelphia, which is now a book entitled Herman Webster Mudgett, Holmes' Own Story.
When I was 8 years old, an unusual occurrence took place in our village. The arrival of an itinerant photographer. He was a man apparently suffering from some lameness, and gladly accepted my offer to act as his errand boy. And in payment for my services, he was to execute a likeness of myself. One morning, upon going to his office, I found the door still locked. It was immediately opened, however, by the artist, sufficiently for him to hand me a small wooden block, broken into 2 pieces. He instructed me to take it to the village wagon maker and have him make a new one, which I was to return to him. I did this, and upon returning to the office again, I found the artist partially clothed and sitting near the door, which he at once locked. He then proceeded to remove the greater portion of one of his legs. And not having known until then what was the cause of his lameness, in fact, not even having seen or ever known that such a thing as artificial limbs existed, my concentration can be better described than imagined. Had he next proceeded to remove his head in the same mysterious way, I should not have been further surprised. He must have noticed my discomfort, for as soon as his mending process had sufficiently progressed, he quickly placed me in dim light and standing upon one leg, and meanwhile waving the other at me. He took my picture, which in a few days he gave to me. I kept it for many years, and the thin, terror-stricken face of that barefooted, homespun-clad boy I can yet see.
Holmes was executed at 10:12 on the morning of May 7th, 1896, at the age of 34. Holmes's last meal was eggs, toast, and coffee. Up on the scaffolding, Holmes stepped forwards and made his last statement to the crowd.
Gentlemen, I have very few words to say. In fact, I would not be making a statement at this time, except for that by not speaking, I would be made to acquiesce in my own execution. I only want to say that the extent of my wrongdoings in the taking of human lives consists of the deaths of 2 women who died at my hands due to criminal operations. I wish to state also, however, so that there will be no misunderstanding hereafter, that I am not guilty of taking any of the lives of the Pitezel family, including the 3 children, the father, or Benjamin F. Pitezel, for whose death I am convicted, and for which I am to be hanged. That is all.
Then Holmes kneeled in silent prayer with Fathers Daly and McPake for several minutes, then stood and shook hands with the men. As the men at the ladder prepared the trap door, Holmes told them,
Take your time, don't bungle it.
The hood and noose were placed. The men asked, Are you ready? Holmes responded,
Yes. Goodbye.
In a cruel twist of irony, the rope did not snap Holmes' neck. He was slowly strangled to death. He twitched for over 15 minutes before he was announced dead. Holmes asked for his coffin to be contained in cement and buried 10 feet deep because of his concerns that grave robbers would steal his body for dissection. In 2017, Holmes was exhumed by the University of Pennsylvania's Anthropology Department to identify his body with DNA evidence due to rumors that he had escaped his execution. The researchers first found an empty coffin filled with cement, and below that, they found a second coffin filled with cement that contained Holmes's body. Imagine that, a 121-year-old elaborate ruse to ward off grave robbers. The DNA evidence was conclusive that this was the body of notorious H.H. Holmes. Reporters and teenagers broke into the castle, wandering the maze-like corridors, staring at its grotesquities and stealing Holmes's abandoned belongings. Patrick Quinlan, the caretaker and janitor of Holmes' hotel, continued to live on the second floor of the burned-out building. The endless streams of vandals and thrill-seekers eventually drove him out of the building. Quinlan had nightmares for the next 19 years. When he called out for help, he claimed he was attacked by strange hallucinations. He claimed the castle was haunted by Holmes and many of his victims. He told his friends that Holmes would visit him in his sleep, and the victims roamed the halls and pecked at the windows of the castle. In 1914, Quinlan committed suicide by drinking a strychnine-based pesticide and met a very painful death. His body was found in his bedroom with a note that read, "I could not sleep." Holmes's castle was mysteriously gutted by a fire in 1895. Two men were seen entering the back of the building between 8 and 9 p.m. About a half an hour later, they were seen exiting the building and rapidly running away. Following several explosions, the castle went up in flames. Later, an empty gas can was found behind the back porch. Now, the building survived the fire and was operational with retail shops on the first floor for another 43 years. In 1938, the city bought the building, tore it down, and replaced it with a post office. So was Holmes driven mad by his encounter with the one-legged photographer? And was Patrick Quinlan haunted by Dr. Holmes and his victims? Well, if you believe the testimony of these two men, they were. Until next time, I'm Joseph J. McAllister, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to see more episodes of Photography's Dark History.